In this lecture, we'll take a look at how we can process individual elements of an array. Now recall that an array is an object, and we have said before that objects could have instance variables. Well, an array does have an instance variable. It has a public final instance variable. So let me reiterate that. Public instance variable. I know it's rare, but we do have one. And this is called length. This length variable gives us the size of the array. And we can use this directly in our programs because, once again, it is a public instance variable. This is one of those rare times where we do have a public instance variable. So for example, if I declare an integer list and I initialize it to 10, 20, 30, and 40, that means list.length, because remember we have the dot in here, so list.length would be 4. And since our array is a fixed size, the length is going to stay the same, no matter how many elements actually have values in them. So here's an example. Let's say I create an integer array called numList, and I initialize it to 10 items. I really shouldn't say initialize, instantiate. So we create an array object of 10 things, and I set numList 0 to 5 and numList 1 to 10. So these are the only two values that have something in there, although technically all the others do have values, they're just zeros. In this case, numList.length is still going to be 10. Doesn't matter how many elements in the array I change, the length is always going to stay the same. It's always going to be 10. Now, if we really want to keep track of the number of elements that have something other than 0 in it, we can create another variable and just keep track of that as we go. Now let's talk about actually processing a one-dimensional array. So what I mean by a one-dimensional array, I'm just talking about like just a single array, a one row of elements. So we have several basic operations that we can perform on an array. So this would include initializing, it would include reading data into the array, we can store output in the array, we could find the largest or smallest element in the array, we can even find the sum or the average of all the elements in the array if the elements contain numeric values. Now, all of these operations will require us to process each element of the array. So how do we go about that? Well, let's think about this for a second. We have a finite number of elements in the array, and we're going to take a look at each element and do something with it. Have we seen a structure that allows us to do some type of multiple iteration over a fixed number of times? Yes, we have. In fact, this screams for loops. So anytime you're dealing with arrays, odds are you're going to be doing something with a for loop. Here's an example where we have the user input values. So we'll create an array list, and maybe there's 100 things in here. So take a look at my condition of my for loop. So here I'm going to check if I is less than list.length. So we can take advantage of our length variable for determining how many times we're going to go through the array. So here we're going to go from 0 to length minus 1, which ironically is also the index number of all the elements in our array. So we can just say list I equals console.nextInt. So this will let the user input 100 values. Now, whether you want to actually type in all 100 values is up to you, but this is just to show that we can easily process each element of the array with just a few lines of code. Here's another example where we're trying to find the sum and the average of all the elements in the array. So once again, we can use our for loop to go through each element of the array. And now to compute the sum, well, I can just say sum plus equals list I. So here we're assuming there are values in list, but we have our sum that's initially 0 before we even get into the loop. And then in the body of loop, we just take the value that's currently stored for sum, and then we just add list to it and store that back in sum. And then once we're done processing all the elements and getting the sum, I can compute the average by taking my current sum and dividing it by the number of elements in the array, which we can determine by using list.length. Now, what about finding the largest element in the array? We're going to use a little trick to make this easier. So instead of keeping track of the actual largest element, we want to keep track of where the largest element is. So we're going to keep track of the index that gives us the largest element. So here's our code that handles this. So we create this variable max index. Let's assume that's already declared somewhere, and we initialize it to 0. Once again, we got a for loop that allows us to go through each element of the array. And notice here that I'm going to start with 1. And this is because I'm going to actually do my first comparison with list 0, which is what max index is. So I don't need to start at 0. I could, but it's just not necessary. So the main line is going to be our if condition right here. So we're going to check to see if list max index, so remember that max index is the index that has our current largest value. We're going to check to see if the element that we're currently looking at is greater than what we consider to be the largest value. And if this is true, then we're going to change the index of where our max value is. And then once we get out of the loop, we can get the largest value by just giving us the value currently at list max index, which that's going to give us our largest value.